Well, hello. Another yes or no question to be examined. This one, for some people, will be quite a controversial one, as is even the phrasing of the question. It is this: can we excuse Franco? Before I remind you who Franco was, I thought a lot about what verb to use here, and alas, Franco's reputation is that of such a violent, destructive individual that I thought I should start out with a kind of pejorative slant on his career and then call upon my yes people to defend the position. So, anyway, okay, well, General Isimo Francisco Franco, known to many as El Caudillo, a strong man, military and political leader, I guess is what it really means in Spanish, um, was, of course, the dictator of Spain. He was the instigator of the bloody Civil War from 1936 to 1939. He was the dictator of Spain from the end of the war until his death in 1975. So he was in the job for a long time. He certainly had time to make his mark on the country. Um, the history is that in 1931, the then King Alfonso XIII was forced out of the throne by a coup, and a Republican government was put in its place. And that Republican government was installed and widely seen to be a left-wing in sensibilities, political movement, strongly allied to the Soviet Union and communism, and and as such, engendered a lot of suspicion, concern, and so forth from those on the far right, which in Spain there were plenty of them. So it was a kind of an unstable situation that it was only a question of time before it blew up, from what I've been able to understand. And blow up it did. The period of the time of the Republic was chaotic. There were assassinations, falls and rise of government. It was a kind of an unmanageable situation, and the army at that time, one of whose generals was Franco, thought that something had to be done. And through a series of coincidences, Francisco Franco, wound up in charge and undertook an invasion from his offshore spot in the Canary Islands, came to Spain and started marching northward. So the war itself was an extremely bloody affair, atrocities on both sides. I mean, just awful. And there were somewhere between 500,000 and 1,000,000 deaths as a result of the war, both deaths in combat and deaths of executions in villages and in cities throughout Spain. The consequence of which is that the experience was so dreadful that people are still, all these 80 years later, still really almost reluctant to talk about it, but angry and on both sides of the political divide. And of course, for many now, it's a question of thinking about burial sites and where their relatives were buried and so forth. So it's an awful business. In any case, Franco came to the end of his life, and he had, in theory, reinstituted the monarchy. I mean, he was a right-wing chap. The monarchy isn't something the left wing would want, so that made sense. But there was no incumbent until very late, not long before he died. he skipped over the heir apparent, the son of Alfonso XIII, and selected his son Juan Carlos. And somehow or other he managed to get Juan Carlos installed as the king, and he died. And as I guess we all know, Juan Carlos had a long reign until he recently was forced to resign over, first of all, some unpleasantness about shooting wild game in Africa, and then after really being caught with his hand in the cookie jar and escaping with a lot of money. So, oh dear, an ignominious end, which would certainly have Franco rolling over in his grave. Okay, well, yeah, because it was such an awful experience, the Civil War, and because Franco initiated it, he has certainly gone down in history as a butcher, and so thus the title of this video. But he still has his defenders, and we'll now hear from them. Yes, we should excuse Franco. Well, first of all, I guess continuing in the story that I was just telling, the nation really was in a form of political crisis and chaos. It wasn't just opposition to leftist policies, but just a kind of an anarchy that was going on. And the army, as often happens in these cases, as in Chile, Egypt, even France in the French Revolution, the army decided they had to step in and do something about the mess. And that's what started it all. So Franco's supporters would say, thank goodness we had a Franco to restore some level of stability and discipline to the nation. The second reason to support Franco was probably his greatest accomplishment, which is the way through devious and adroit diplomacy he kept Spain out of the Second World War. He, by politics, was someone certainly more aligned with the fascists, and would have therefore been drawn into an alliance with Hitler and Mussolini, and indeed they courted him. Hitler came to Spain for that purpose, and according to the legend, the discussions Hitler had with Franco, and Franco changing the subject and ducking out of any kind of commitment, drove Hitler crazy, and he made the famous comment about, I'd rather have all my teeth pulled than have to deal with this man again. So, yeah, good for Franco. He managed to stay out. Franco had been advised by a high-ranking German official that not only was was Germany's cause very much in question and even doomed when, and it was inevitably just a when, America came into the war, but also he obviously worried about how if Spain was part of the Axis, what would be the first country geographically the Americans would come into as an invading force? It would be Spain, because they jut out into the Atlantic as they do. So, more power to Franco. He managed to save Spain from the devastation of the Second World War. Spain certainly had a lot of problems after the Civil War, but this had already been was behind them, and so entering the war would have obviously made it even worse. So good for him. A third reason to be favorable about Franco was that after a number of years of getting it wrong in terms of running the economy, he basically forbade international trade and kind of closed the borders to Spain, and as a consequence of that, the economy declined. But he then opened it up in, I believe it was in 1959, He was advised by a group of skilled economists who understood what had to be done. Interestingly, from Opus Dei, the secretive Catholic organization, but stuffed with very smart people, whatever their political views. And there was a Spanish miracle. The economy came bounding back, and really, by the time he died, wasn't in that bad shape. And then finally, when you think about it, a final enormous accomplishment on his part was to design and implement a peaceful change of government from his dictatorship to that of a constitutional monarchy run by King Juan Carlos. It worked. There was a couple of little glitches along the way, but he managed that transition, and that is one of his greatest legacies. Okay, well, that's not too bad. He doesn't sound like that awful a person. It has a few important accomplishments under his belt. What about those who say, no, he should not be excused? Well, I guess we really have to go back to the Civil War. The Civil War was just dreadful. It was a violent one. Prisoners were butchered on both sides, but that doesn't excuse him. There were not only, of course, combatants who were killed even when taken into captivity, but there were executions in villages and towns in Spain. Just a dreadful business. And all of that has to be laid at Franco's feet, because he was the one who took it upon himself to invade, to attempt a military coup, which finally succeeded. And it was just a dreadful butchery all along the way. Furthermore, once he was in power, he continued as not only a strong man and a tough leader, but also one who repressed and executed political opponents still along the way. A pretty nasty chap, really, a kind of a thug, to be honest. Even though he was a fairly educated man, came from a pretty good background, but a pretty nasty person, and one who did not shrink at the prospect of violence and murder in order to advance his political creed. Next, his cutting off of international trade, of closing the borders economically, to which I referred earlier, really was dreadful. As I acknowledged, he eventually saw some common sense and reversed the policies, but in the process, he severely damaged the Spanish economy, and the legacy lived on even after the so-called Spanish miracle. I can remember for a time I lived in Spain and remembered fairly early on that you could only buy one make of car in Spain, the Spanish car, which it was eventually taken over and sorted out, and then other car companies were allowed to build factories there. But in the process, the Spanish, in a way reminiscent of the old days in England, had lousy cars. They just didn't last. And that was a sort of symbol of his running of the economy. He finally woke up and did something about it, but fairly late in his, I was going to say, reign. And then finally, there was the position of the Catholic Church. Of course, the Catholic Church was on the side of the nationalists, being the side of the right end of the political spectrum, siding with the aristocrats, the people threatened by the left-wing policies of the Republic. But the Catholic Church was given considerable power by Franco. For instance, in parishes, they often had political power in the community. In order to get a job in many places, you had to have a good conduct certificate from the local priest. Imagine the kind of power that imbued. And some of the vestiges of those sorts of restrictions live on and still exist in Spain. You can't get married in a church in Spain unless you're a Catholic, for instance. And so that kind of strengthening of the position of a church, which people increasingly saw as kind of autocratic and not in their interest, is a reason for not supporting Franco. You could, of course, say, well, it was understandable that he wanted to support the church and give it some protection because it went through horrors during the Civil War. I think 7,000 members of the clergy, both priests, nuns, and so forth, were killed, and during the war, not as combatants, but executed really by people within their own community. So the feelings ran high. I remember my wife and I standing near a cliff in one of the white towns in Andalusia, where there was a sign that explained that this is the spot where they threw priests into the ravine to die on the rocks below. Oh my goodness! So I suppose you could excuse him a little bit on that, but Franco was not a devout Catholic. He simply used the Catholic Church for what he could get out of it. But nonetheless, the legacy of the church is something that many people who opposed Franco deeply resented. Okay, well, what's my take on this? Do we excuse him or not? My answer is no. I believe there is no excuse for the kinds of violence that he used to achieve his ends. You might argue with me and say, I don't know how he would have got the job done otherwise. And for that matter, I don't know what would have happened if the Republic had continued to be in place when the Second World War started. That's another whole scenario. And it may be that Franco did save the nation from the abominations of the Second World War. But I still don't excuse his behavior, his fanatic political partisanship, and his bloodlust. So, sorry, there it is. That debate, I think, will continue for generations in Spain. It was such a traumatic time. In a way, as the debate about the Civil War in America has gone on for over a century. Okay. Well, hope you enjoyed that. Give me a like if you did. Subscribe. Please subscribe. Make any suggestions. Make comments. Hit the notification bell. And thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.